In early March, beneath the sheer cliffs outside Fordo, Iran believed its most sensitive missile and nuclear assets were untouchable. Buried nearly 100 meters deep, shielded by ultra-reinforced concrete, and protected by decades of engineering, these underground networks were designed to survive anything. Billions had been spent. Generations had built them. They were wrong. Within hours, over 2,000 precision-guided munitions began collapsing entrances, sealing tunnels, and turning those hidden complexes into sealed tombs. But it was not just the firepower that broke them. It was a flaw built into the system itself. And once exposed, there was no escape. For years, Iran's underground strategy was built on a simple assumption: depth equals survival. If critical assets could be buried deep enough inside mountains, no air force on Earth could reach them. Facilities like Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan were the crown jewels of that doctrine. Tunnels carved through solid rock, layered with high-density concrete, and designed with complex offset corridors to absorb shockwaves. On paper, it looked nearly perfect. But modern warfare no longer works on paper. The first aircraft to challenge that assumption did not announce their arrival. The B-2 Spirit bombers entered Iranian airspace almost invisibly, slipping past radar systems that had been designed to detect conventional threats. By the time Iran's air defenses reacted, it was already too late. The targets had already been selected. Each B-2 carried some of the most powerful bunker-busting munitions ever deployed. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, weighing roughly 30,000 pounds, was specifically designed for one purpose: to reach what others could not. These bombs did not explode on impact. They drilled downward, cutting through layers of earth and reinforced concrete before detonating deep underground. And they hit with precision. Fordo was among the first to feel the impact. The outer protective layers that once symbolized invulnerability were breached in seconds. Shockwaves traveled through internal tunnel networks, damaging critical systems far beyond the initial point of impact. At Natanz and Isfahan, entrances were struck repeatedly, not to destroy the entire complex, but to isolate it. That distinction mattered, because the goal was not just destruction, it was paralysis. Within the first 72 hours, more than 2,300 strategic targets were hit across multiple regions. Nearly half of them were directly connected to underground infrastructure. Tunnel entrances, access roads, power nodes, and communication links were systematically targeted. Every strike was part of a larger pattern. Cut the surface and the underground dies with it. As the bombing campaign intensified, US aircraft maintained constant patrols over key areas. The airspace was no longer contested. It was controlled. Any movement near tunnel entrances, any attempt to deploy mobile launchers, was detected almost instantly. And once detected, it was eliminated. Iran's underground network had not yet been destroyed, but it had already lost something far more important: freedom to operate. At first, the tunnels did not collapse, and that was exactly the problem. Because what followed was not a single moment of destruction, but a slow and systematic shutdown. The entrances that connected these deep facilities to the outside world became the primary targets. One after another, they were sealed, cratered, or buried under tons of debris. Inside, everything depended on those access points. Missiles could not be moved, fuel could not be delivered, personnel could not rotate, and more critically, air could not circulate. Ventilation systems, often overlooked in the design of underground fortifications, quickly became a fatal weakness. Precision strikes targeted surface-level ventilation shafts and support systems. Once those were destroyed, conditions deep inside the tunnels began to deteriorate rapidly. Darkness spread first, then heat, then silence. Without stable airflow, without power, and without access to the surface, entire sections of these facilities became isolated pockets. Equipment remained intact in many areas. Missiles were still stored, launch systems were still physically there, but none of it could be used. At the same time, surveillance from above tightened even further. High-resolution satellites and unmanned aerial systems tracked every possible movement near the remaining operational entrances. The moment a launcher attempted to emerge, even briefly, it was immediately identified, and within seconds, targeted. This created a new reality. Launching a missile was no longer just an act of retaliation. It became an act of exposure. Field data from late February to mid-March revealed how quickly this pressure translated into operational decline. During a critical 2-week window, Iran managed to launch approximately 650 missiles and just over 1,800 drones. On the surface, those numbers still appeared significant. But the trend told a different story. In the early phase of the conflict, daily launch capacity had reached nearly 400 missiles per day. Now, that number had dropped sharply. In some sectors, launch rates fell by more than 85%. Entire stockpiles remained trapped underground, inaccessible behind collapsed entrances and damaged infrastructure. The weapons existed, but they might as well not have. More concerning was the growing number of systems that became permanently unusable. With tunnel sections cut off and power systems disrupted, maintenance became impossible. Guidance systems degraded, fuel supplies became unstable, control links failed. What had once been a hidden arsenal was now turning into a sealed storage of unusable firepower. And the pressure did not stop. Continuous aerial patrols ensured that no recovery effort could take place. Engineering teams could not safely approach the damaged entrances. Repair attempts were detected and disrupted almost immediately. Every hour that passed made the situation worse. Because this was no longer about breaking the tunnels, it was about breaking the system behind them. By the end of the first phase of the campaign, one conclusion had become unavoidable. Iran's underground missile cities had not been destroyed. They had been neutralized. By the second week of March, the operation entered a new phase. The initial strikes had already done their job. The underground network was no longer functioning as a coordinated system, but from Washington's perspective, partial paralysis was not enough. They wanted finality. That was when the B-1B Lancer entered the battlefield. Dawadia, unlike the B-2, which specialized in deep penetration and strategic bunker strikes, the B-1B brought something different: speed, payload, and sustained pressure. These aircraft could carry more than 30 tons of munitions and deliver them rapidly across multiple targets in a single sortie. And this time, the focus shifted even more aggressively to the surface. Footage from RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom revealed a critical change. Traditional cruise missile configurations were being removed from the B-1B's weapons bays. In their place, large numbers of 2,000-pound JDAM precision bombs were being installed. This was not preparation for deep strikes. This was preparation for systematic dismantling. As B-1Bs began their runs, the pattern became clear almost immediately. Instead of targeting the deepest parts of the facilities, they went after what remained functional on the outside. Entrance gates, support buildings, power distribution points, and access roads were hit in rapid succession. Kormuj was among the first to feel the impact. The base's external infrastructure was overwhelmed in minutes. Entry points that had survived earlier strikes were now completely buried. Heavy equipment stationed near the tunnels was destroyed before it could even be deployed. Within hours, the site was no longer operational in any meaningful sense. Then came Baharistan. Here, the strikes were even more coordinated. Multiple JDAMs, guided by satellite targeting systems, hit in tightly sequenced intervals. The goal was not just to damage, but to ensure that no single access point could be reopened quickly. Roads leading to the tunnels were cut off. Structural supports near entrances were destabilized. Everything that connected underground to surface was severed. JDAMs proved devastating in this role. Their precision allowed them to hit narrow, critical nikat with almost no margin of error. A single well-placed strike could collapse an entrance completely. And once that happened, the consequences were permanent. Missiles stored behind those blocked passages would never be launched. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were trapped. This approach turned Iran's own infrastructure against itself. The deeper and more complex the tunnel network was, the more dependent it became on a limited number of functional access points. And once those points were eliminated, the entire system shut down. By the time B-1B operations intensified, the remaining launch capability on the ground had dropped to minimal levels. Attempts to restore access were sporadic and largely unsuccessful. Any visible repair effort triggered immediate surveillance and follow-up strikes. The pressure was constant, and it was escalating. Because now, the operation was no longer about gaining control. It was about making sure nothing could recover. In the end, it was not the depth that failed. It was the design. Iran's underground doctrine had been built on a belief shaped decades earlier during the Iran-Iraq War. Back then, going deeper meant surviving longer, air power was limited, precision was rare, and once something was buried, it was effectively hidden. But that world no longer exists. Modern warfare does not need to destroy what is underground. It only needs to control what connects it to the surface. Every tunnel, no matter how deep, depends on a small number of critical lifelines, entrances, ventilation systems, power connections, access routes. These are not optional features. They are the only way an underground facility can function, and every single one of them exists above ground. That was the flaw. The entrances, often concealed along mountain slopes, were still fixed locations. Once identified through satellite imaging and drone surveillance, they became predictable targets. Precision-guided munitions did not need to guess. They struck exact coordinates repeatedly until those needed were no longer usable. Ventilation systems proved even more vulnerable. Without airflow, the deepest and most secure chambers became uninhabitable. Personnel could not remain inside for long periods. Sensitive equipment could not operate under unstable conditions. The deeper the facility, the more dependent it was on these fragile systems. And once those systems failed, depth became irrelevant. At the same time, intelligence superiority ensured that nothing stayed hidden for long. High-resolution satellites monitored structural changes. Drones tracked even minor movements near tunnel exits. The moment activity was detected, it was fed directly into targeting systems. There was no delay. There was no uncertainty. There was no place to hide. As operations continued, another critical layer emerged. These tunnels were not only housing missiles and drones. Some of the most sensitive components of Iran's nuclear program were also located within these networks. Fordo, buried deep within a mountain, held over 1,000 centrifuges and significant quantities of enriched uranium. Natanz played a similar role in the enrichment process. These were not just military assets. They were strategic leverage, which is why the strikes followed a multi-layered approach. First, deep penetration bombs targeted critical internal structures. Then, follow-up attacks sealed entrances, isolating whatever remained inside. Reports suggested that access to certain materials had been reduced to extremely limited points, if not completely cut off. This changed the equation entirely, because now the loss was not just about firepower, it was about control. At the same time, Iran's air defense systems failed to alter the outcome. Despite years of investment, they could not effectively challenge stealth aircraft or sustain bombing runs. B-2s, B-1Bs, and other platforms operated with increasing freedom. Airspace was no longer contested, it was dominated. And once that dominance was established, everything below it became vulnerable. Farting, what was once presented as a symbol of strength, began to reveal itself as a structural liability. The more complex and expensive the underground network became, the more it relied on a fragile interface with the surface. And once that interface was broken, the entire system collapsed inward. Not in an explosion, but in silence. Looking ahead, the implications extend far beyond these tunnels. For years, Iran's underground infrastructure served as the backbone of a broader regional strategy. Missiles and drones stored in these facilities were not only for domestic defense, they were part of a supply chain reaching across the Middle East. From Yemen to Lebanon, from proxy groups to strategic deterrence. Now, that chain has been disrupted. With launch capacity reduced and stockpiles trapped, the ability to sustain external operations becomes increasingly limited. Regional actors that once depended on consistent resupply may now face uncertainty. Every launch, every deployment becomes a calculated risk, because there is no guarantee of replacement. This marks the beginning of a different phase. Not a sudden end, but a slow exhaustion. And yet, the danger is not entirely gone. Remaining missile and drone capabilities, though reduced, can still create instability in the short term. This raises a critical question for the future of the conflict. Does this end with containment, or does it continue until nothing remains? Because if the strategy continues, the objective becomes clear: not just to neutralize underground networks, but to eliminate the capacity to rebuild them completely.